Former U.S. President George H.W. Bush was honored with a state funeral today. Brian Mulroney was one of 4 people who delivered a eulogy. During his time as Prime Minister, Mulroney got to know the senior Bush well, and they remained friends until Bush's death last week. Today, Mulroney remembered the man's sense of humor, recalling Bush's first NATO meeting.
George was taking copious notes as the heads of government spoke. We were all limited in time. But you know, it's very flattering to have the President of the United States take notes as you speak. And even someone as modest as me threw in a few more adjectives here and there to extend the pleasure of the experience. After President Mitterrand, Prime Minister Thatcher, and Chancellor Kohl had spoken, it was the turn of the Prime Minister of Iceland, who, as President Bush continued to write, went on and on and on and on, ending only when the Secretary General of NATO firmly decreed a coffee break. George put down his pen, walked over to me and said, "Brian, I've just learned the fundamental principle of international affairs." I said, "What's that, George?" He said, "The smaller the country, the longer the speech."
Earlier today, I spoke with former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney following his tribute inside Washington National Cathedral. And former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney is in Washington. Hi, Mr. Mulroney. Thanks so much for joining us and for making time for us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Mulroney, you spoke today in your eulogy, and you've mentioned it before many times, of President Bush's affection for Canada. What do you think that was rooted in?
Well, he's from Maine, as you know. He's lived in Walker's Point and spent the summers there for, 90 years, I guess, pretty close to that. And so he's come to know Canada, obviously. And as Vice President, he had a lot to do with us. He was extremely helpful even then as Vice President. And when he came back down as to become President, all of a sudden, the acid rain file, for example, that had been stalled for years and years. You know, I can remember when President Reagan came to Ottawa in 1981, I think it was, with Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. There were 50,000 people out on the lawns of Parliament Hill and protesting what? Acid rain. It was the most lethal challenge to our environment, probably in the 151-year history of Canada. And so I had made this case to Bush while he was Vice President. The first call that he made after his inaugural address, State to the Union, was to me. And he said, "Brian, I'm coming up. I'd like to come up to see you first. And we have something to talk about." I said, "That's terrific, George." And he came up to have lunch and dinner with me at 24 Sussex, and a working meetings at 7 Rideau Gate. And at the end of which he said, privately, he said, "I've instructed my people to stop thinking in terms of competitiveness and start thinking in terms of the environment." And he said, "I am going to proceed, and you and I are going to sign an acid rain treaty." Now, nobody mentions acid rain anymore. Why? Because the problem has been essentially solved. Not perfectly, not 100%, but almost. This was George Bush. He changed American policy like that to accommodate Canada. And he made it very clear in his speech. This, Mr. Mulroney, Prime Minister Mulroney told me, the environment is a litmus test of our relationship. And therefore, you guys are going to do it. And that's how we got the deal. That's pretty important for a Canadian Prime Minister to have a friend like that in the Oval Office.
And I know your friendship continued, you know, when you were both outside of office as well. I read, I think you told the Globe that you thought writing this eulogy would be the toughest writing assignment you've ever had to do. Did it end up being really tough, or did it offer you some comfort?
No, when I got it done, the one you saw today on television, I was pleased with it because to the best of my capability, I was reflecting for you the George Bush that I had come to know and admire so much. So it became a challenge of the writing of it, but then it kind of flowed naturally right to the end, where I talked about that incident that occurred at his home in September of 2001.
How did your friendship with President Bush change once you were both out of office?
Well, I was in office for a while after George was defeated in November, and I kept in close touch with him, as I always did. When I traveled around the world, I would call him from l'Élysée and say, you know, George, I just had lunch with François Mitterrand, and he told me that in such a dossier or such a conflict or what have you, you treated France and him beautifully. And he said, I doubt we'll ever have this kind of a relationship again. Well, it was like that for many leaders around the world, because George Bush was such a gentleman, a man of his word, a modest man who understood your problems as well as his own, and always tried to find a solution that might accommodate both. I'll tell you, he was a hell of a guy.
Your eulogy and many of the others really, I felt, stressed his character. Every single one took time to mention. I mean, you called him specifically just now an honest, but you also called him a gentleman. Why is character so important in a leader, and do you think it's as valued now as it was when he was president?
No, I think we're in a new era, and of course, you know, we have to understand that there's social media and cell phones and all of these things that weren't around when we were in office. And so because of that, much more emphasis was put on the personal touch, on building a personal relationship, mutually advantageous and beneficial. And that takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of travel, it takes a lot of interest, and it takes a lot of tenacity. You've got to keep going. And that's what I tried to do. And then when George Bush came in, I found a willing collaborator on most of these files. Hell, we did the NAFTA. We did the Acid Rain Treaty. Right there are two huge ticket items. And he's responsible for both.
Come with me. He led me down the porch at Walker's Point to the side of the house that fronts the ocean and pointed to a small, simple plaque that had been unobtrusively installed just some days earlier. It read, CAVU. George said, Brian, this stands for Ceiling and Visibility Unlimited. When I was a terrified 18 to 19-year-old pilot in the Pacific, those were the words we hoped to hear before takeoff. It meant perfect flying. And that's the way I feel about our life today. CAVU. Everything is perfect. Bar and I could not have asked for better lives. We are truly happy and truly at peace.
Earlier, we played a portion of our conversation with Mr. Mulroney about George H.W. Bush. We also spoke about Canada-U.S. relations, though, past and present. Mulroney said he told Bush that he viewed the environmental challenge of acid rain as a litmus test of the relationship between Canada and the U.S. I asked him what the litmus test is now between our two countries.
Oh, I would say the litmus test now is for the reestablishment of a genuinely effective and enjoyable personal relationship between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump. There are two major files that a Prime Minister has on his desk at all times, and only two. The rest can be farmed out to your team. National unity and the Canada-US relationship. Nobody can deal with these matters effectively or directly than the Prime Minister. You can't send a minister with all the affection we might have for him or her to the Oval Office, because you're never going to get in. There are 193 countries at the United Nations, all of whose presidents are trying to get a photo op or a meeting with President Trump. And Canada, while I was there, Canada was at the top of that list. We didn't have to worry about seeing anybody. He'd call me up and invite me down for a discussion on some of these matters. And I think it's important for Mr. Trudeau to work that file to the certainty that that gets done. Now, the question is, can it be done given the pretty rough circumstances between Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Trump from time to time? The answer is yes. It's in America's self-interest to be on friendly terms with Canada, and it's an absolutely indispensable reality for Canada to have the President of the United States on side. Because let me tell you, without him, you're not going to go far in international leadership issues around the globe.
Do you consider Mr. Trump a friend?
Well, I've known him for 25 years, as you know, socially in New York and in Palm Beach. I've never had a business dealing with him. I've never had a serious series of conversations, but we were social friends. And so I saw him at the funeral today, and I'll see him in Palm Beach at Christmas. And I always talk up Canada every time I see him. But you know, he's quite capable of a full, as you know, of a full reversal of fortune, and start calling Justin the way Bush and Reagan used to call me. And I guarantee you, when Donald Trump calls, Mr. Trudeau is going to pick up the phone, and good things are going to happen.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Mulroney. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.